Okay, folks, I think it's time to get started. Well, first of all, hello and welcome to our first webinar by Skill Dynamics. A very, very warm welcome to you from our team. I've got Marie and Jess who are in the background and have done a wonderful job in putting this together. So just to give you a bit of a background, I'm a professor in supply chain management at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm also the executive strategy advisor for Skill Dynamics. And one of the principal roles that I have for Skill Dynamics is to produce content to ensure that we are, remaining at the cutting edge of thought leadership within the world of procurement, logistics, and supply chain management. And in relation to that, one of the things that I do is content, whether that's written, and you will see some examples of our white papers at the end of the presentation, but also through webinars and speaking at events globally. So what I'd like to start off with is that why are we talking about resilience? And it's almost like a daft question to even put that at the forefront of this presentation, because we live in a world which is in a constant state of flux, a lot of challenges, as we can see, not in just our personal lives, but also in our professional lives. But actually, the starting point of this was we did actually do a poll, as we're a very demand-driven organization. We did a poll and put a question out to ask, what are the kind of topics that are of most interest or most challenging to you and that you would like us to talk about. And actually, this topic, resilience, was the one that was nominated as the leading topic that seemed to be challenging most of you. So I'm delighted to be here with you today. And for the next 45 minutes or so, my aim is going to be to share with you my sort of, research perspectives and also some insights that I have on how we can better achieve resilience in a turbulent world. So very, very, very warm welcome to you all. So to begin with, let's start with really setting the context of this very sort of turbulent and volatile world that we're living in. And it's this understanding, you're probably sick and tired of hearing about the terms, this new normal. But it's really trying to get this understanding that actually the world that we're around and the unpredictability and the constant uncertainties that we face, they're actually a lot more of a common occurrence than one would like them to be. So it's recognizing that the world around us is changing. We are living in an age of radical uncertainty. And as the world, battles this, the worst pandemic that we've witnessed in over 100 years, it's actually served as a reminder that even the most well-oiled supply chains can be impacted by disasters in another part of the world. They can be impacted by unexpected turbulence, or they can be affected by events that are very difficult to forecast. Now, from climate change issues to pandemics, from insulate Britain to global trade wars, and of course, the growing geopolitical uncertainties that we're seeing unfold around us, to labor shortages. There is absolutely no receding to the list of supply chain risks. And all of these have got the potential to disrupt our supply chains. Now, while most of you will argue that, well, these are largely unexpected, how is one supposed to know about these? They're like outside in the wider supply chain. But I will argue and say that they are systemic in nature. So supply chain risks are systemic. In other words, they occur because of a failure in our supply chain system. Just take a look around you. Some of the real impacts that supply chain failure is having everywhere around us. In recent months, British car production is at its lowest for almost 50 years because of the failure to source microchips. There's a looming food shortage for very similar reasons. Now, from a UK perspective, if I could give that as an example, we were working pretty well pre-Brexit with just-in-time arrangements, with an ample supply of labor. There was no long, but this is no longer available to us. And this is having a massive impact on our supply chains. Another example I can give you is during Christmas time. Like many of you, I love shopping trips in London and going to Hamleys, for example, and other toy retailers. They were very concerned at the time that they were not going to get enough toys in time for Christmas, partly due to the blockages that were caused in the Suez Canal by a global shortage of containers. So what does this all mean? Well, I believe what it means is that whatever business we're in, we're going to have to take a fresh look at the arrangements that we're going to have to make. And clearly, the emphasis has got to be on much higher levels of flexibility, right? We're not going to make any arrangements that's fixed for any lengthy period of time. We don't want to fix things into concrete. And that means that, well, the way that I look at it is that I want to develop a portfolio of relationships. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the past, we were looking at perhaps single sourcing, and for very good reasons, we were looking at this, right? We were looking at this for very good reasons. But now what we want to do is we want to pay, we even though we're going to have to pay more for having these portfolio relationships, what we're looking for is options in our supply chain. So yes, flexibility is going to cost us more, but it gives us that redundant capacity that we require when times get tough. Now, Apple is a really good case in point. Over the years, Apple has spent a lot of money. In some cases, it's been even investing in its suppliers. And we saw that many, many years ago with the likes of Marks and Spencer's 20, 30 years ago. Now, Apple, they invest in their suppliers, which means that they buy the machinery, which means they have sole access to that machinery. They buy capacity ahead of time. Even at times when they're not sure what they're going to do with that capacity, but they will buy it ahead of time. And these work like insurance policies. And another great example I can give you is of Zara, which is part of the Inditex group. Zara pre-designs to fabric capacity. So it will pre-purchase fabric capacity, weave and knit the fabric, which is the longest part of the sort of the textile supply chain process. And it doesn't give the designers a free will. It constrains the designers to design to that fabric capacity. But what does that mean? It means that Zara is able to be responsive. It's able to be flexible to whatever market changes require from it, and thereby allowing them to actually respond to the fastest lead time that I think supply chains in history have ever actually witnessed. So this idea where we invest in our suppliers, where we have sole access to warehousing space, distribution space, to people, to skills, and so on, is something that we seriously need to consider. Now, if the current climate of turbulence and volatility continues, it is critical to build resilience into our supply chains. And whilst it's cliche to say that we're living in an age of uncertainty, this is the reality. And we need a change of focus. We need to change our focus to flexibility, to agility, and to resilience. And in my presentation today, I will highlight how agility and flexibility are the key to resilience. I will discuss the principles of agility and the steps that are necessary to create an agile supply chain. And this will include our people, as well as our systems and our processes. So, why are today's supply chains vulnerable? Well, in order to answer that question, I think it's fundamental to understand the trends that got us to where we are today. Now, most supply chains today were designed some years ago when the world was a very different place, when businesses had experienced several decades of relative stability in the competitive environment. And most, they held the assumption that the future will be pretty much like the past and that supply chains will still be fit for purpose. the focus remained on cost optimization. The emphasis was on efficiency and long planning horizons. And these were stretching way into the future because of the relative sort of stable conditions that the forecast was actually built on. However, I'm sure you will all agree with me, conditions began to change. And when they began to change, they started to change rapidly. Volatility and turbulence is now the backdrop against which all decisions must be based on. And one of the main reasons has been the increase in uncertainty. So this is making it very difficult for us to plan ahead using the conventional forecast-based systems that we used in the past. So what I'm basically saying here is that in the new normal, the supply chain will have to change accordingly. Rather than forecast-driven, what we need is to be much more demand-driven, and we must be responsive to change. So we've moved from this yesterday's model of mass production and forward planning to a world where market responsiveness and flexibility are the key drivers. And instead of designing the supply chain backwards, from the factory outwards, it must be designed from the customer backwards. Fundamentally, what I'm saying here is we need to turn the supply chain on its head, where we start with the customer as the departure point rather than the final destination. So in order to link customer value with our supply chain strategy, this really requires a number of key things. First of all, we must identify the value segments. So what I'm basically saying here is, do you understand what your customers value? Second, define your value proposition. We need to recognize how to translate these requirements into an offer. Third, identify the market winners. So it's important here to understand, what does it take for us to succeed in this marketplace? And fourth, develop the supply chain strategy. And this is where we're aligning against the value proposition. So the key question here is, how do we deliver against this value proposition? And now, folks, I actually think this very simple but very useful exercise is one that you can do with your process teams, your product teams, and it's a very useful way to sort of align your customer value proposition to your supply chain segments. So do give it a go. Now, I think it's really important to understand some of the characteristics of world-class supply chains. And when I say world-class supply chains, I've used the Gartner's top 25 here just as a metric. I could have used any other metric, but the Gartner is one very well known and established within our supply chain procurement communities. So hence I've used that. But it's really important to understand, what do all of these have in common? Because I believe from the research I've been doing in the last 20 years or so, there's a lot of common sort of characteristics amongst these top 25 and top 10 Gartner companies. First of all, their processes are closely aligned to the company's value proposition. They focus on responsiveness, and they constantly seek to drive out complexity from their supply chains. That's a very important one. One of the things that we have done over the years is we've built in a lot of unnecessary waste, a lot of unnecessary complexity in our supply chains. So, for example, if we have a single product line, but we want to, advance on that product range, we've introduced so much complexity into the process or into the manufacturing or into the process steps that is not really required. And Lego is a really good case in point. 20 years ago or so, Lego was one of the leading toy makers in the world. I think it still is one of the leading, if not the leading. But they really had to consolidate their their brick format when they had overcomplicated their product range. And after doing some very expensive market research, had actually basically evaluated that, by consolidating their basic shapes from 14,500 to 6,500 actually wouldn't ruin the market potential of what they were doing there, but it massively reduced the complexity in their supply chains. The fourth point I'd like to share here in terms of common characteristics is that these supply chains are very customer centric, they're customer driven, they're cross-functional, and they're not siloed. Now, there may also be AAA. Now, AAA supply chains is a concept that was coined by a professor at Stanford University called Professor Hao Li. And I believe this is very important for us when we consider developing resilience in our supply chains, because I believe that agility, adaptability, and alignment are all prerequisites for us to acquire resilience in our supply chains. So to meet this challenge, businesses have to focus on greater agility, adaptability, and alignment. And fundamentally, what they have to do is respond rapidly in terms of volume and variety change. In other words, AAA supply chains need to be able to adjust output quickly to match market demand. And they need to switch rapidly from one variant to another very quickly. Now, to a truly agile business, volatility of demand is not a problem. Its processes and its organizational structure, as well as the supply chain relationships that it's developed, enables it to cope with whatever demands are placed upon it. So first of all, let's start with the agility. And here, what I guess I'm referring to is that what we have to do is synchronize our activities through shared information. And this basically implies that all the parties in our extended enterprise, they're all marching to the same drumbeat. In other words, through shared information and our process alignment, there's one set of numbers and there's a single schedule for the entire supply chain. Now, web-based technology and cloud computing providers are already making this so much more achievable today by enabling different entities in the same network to share information on real demand, inventory, capacity in a much more collaborative context. And by improving the visibility of demand, companies can actually reduce their forecast error, their safety stock, and they can develop a continuous replenishment approach. And this principle of substituting information for inventory is so relevant in any industry, but particularly where the cost of inventory is so high. Now, the second point I'd like to make is about working smarter, not harder. Many processes in the supply chain are lengthy because activities were often performed in a very linear, sequential, one way after another approach. So there's a lot of opportunities here for us to compress time to marketplace using this approach. And by, so not wasting any, because there's just so much wasted non-value adding time in our supply chains. Remember that point I made about complexity, for example. So it's possible to reduce lead times by conducting supply chain mapping processes, re-engineer our processes where activities can be performed simultaneously. So I think another point to make when we talk about agility is this idea about postponement. We need to adapt. We need to really postpone activities in our supply chain. And ideally, this should really begin on the drawing board, where products are designed with late configuration in mind. But it could also be about holding inventory in few locations around the world with the ability to send products rapidly to another location when, as soon as an order is received. And I think the point that I make here is that it's about keeping, working as vanilla state or as in generic work in progress as possible, because this gives us the flexibility to change, amend, modify to our customer requirements rapidly. Now, when we think about alignment, greater alignment can be achieved if we actually manage processes and not just functions. I think the key point I want to make here is that function-based organizations are very inwardly focused. And this leads to a very silo type mentality. These organizations are very slow to respond to changes in the market because there's so many, there's multiple handoffs as things get passed on from one function to another, which causes a lot of delays. But companies that are able to respond quickly to changing customer requirements, they tend to focus a lot more on processes. They're cross-functional by definition, and they're managed by interdisciplinary teams. I like to take an example of the Marvel superheroes like Avengers or X-Men as an example to describe the superhero process teams that we all want to create. And this starts fundamentally from training, which Skill Dynamics are excellent providers of, and right through the supply chain, right? These superhero process teams have relevant competencies, but those competencies are not good enough if they cannot stretch across the bandwidth of the organization. So we think about like let's take the X-Men. The X-Men, are a stronger force for good when they combine their skills together, right? They're strong enough and robust as single with the single skills that they may have. I'm trying to think of the Marvel heroes here, like Storm and whatever. But don't they work better together when they combine those skills? So businesses should consider how they can increase the clock speed of their processes by borrowing ideas of time compression from other industries such as automotive, consumers, electronics, and fashion industries, all of which we at Skill Dynamics work with. So just to summarize some of the principles here, to develop a AAA supply chain, a responsive business will have agile suppliers. It will work closely with them to align the processes across the extended enterprise. It will be quick to adapt to changing customer demands because it works closer to its customers. It captures information on real demand, and it shares that information with its partners across the network. Internally, the business will also be focused on agility because of the way it organizes. It breaks through these functional silos to create these superhero process teams. And in terms of manufacturing and the sourcing strategy, the responsive business will seek to marry the lean and the agile paradigms through decoupling its supply chain, its upstream and downstream processes by utilizing the principles of postponement whenever it makes sense to do so. So this really takes me to the idea that when we start recognizing that we live in a very uncertain world, resilience is key to our survival. And therefore, supply chains must be adaptable and flexible. And this idea of structure flexibility, I wanted to share with you. It was a very interesting academic peer-reviewed journal paper by Professor Martin Christopher and his colleague Matthias Holweg from Cambridge University that developed this notion of structure flexibility. And what they were basically highlighting here is that perhaps this is one of the most powerful ways in which we can enhance supply chain resilience is by achieving structure flexibility. And basically what this reflects is the ability of the supply chain to adapt, to reconfigure its architecture in response to major changes on either the demand side or the supply side of the network. Now, the key to structure flexibility is to recognize that the best decisions in a turbulent and volatile world are often those decisions which have the most options open. Now, this may not produce the lowest cost solution, but this should ensure that the supply chain is capable of changing as conditions change. Now, one implication of this is that the ownership of supply chain assets, for example, factories, distribution centers, inventory, they might actually inhibit our flexibility. So there could be benefit in seeking agreements to access assets owned by others. And sometimes this could involve sharing assets or renting them. And this might mean that, it will give us greater flexibility in times of hardship. It will give us greater options to draw on inventories when we need them, to draw on inventories when they cannot be pre-purchased, or to move them through a distribution center that we do not own, and to manufacture or assemble products in factories that are owned or managed by contract manufacturers or even by our competitors. But in a sense, it really is the ability to turn the tap on and off quickly, which provides the key to supply chain resilience. So there's a couple of points here which you can actually use as a checklist to gain structural flexibility. And I've just shared with you the idea of the sharing economy and gaining sort of structural flexibility and so forth. Now, transformation won't, we've got to recognize that this is not going to happen overnight. We're not going to be able to all of a sudden wake up tomorrow and say that we're a truly resilient enterprise. But I do believe that change is underway. Pieces of supply chain are being transformed and they're being digitalized. But I think what the real challenge for all of us is the connection between those pieces. Because the systems need to be in place, not just the pieces. And what we've got to recognize is that the real benefits actually lie in people investment, in reskilling and upskilling our supply chain and procurement professionals so that they're able to adapt and adjust to this new landscape. Companies like Amazon and Ocado, for example, I could mention many others. Gymshark, for example, I'm a big fan of. They've got the luxury of being able to build their systems from scratch. But those companies that are built on sort of heritage and legacy leadership, it becomes much more difficult for them. So it's important to recognize that transformation won't happen overnight. And part of the problem is that there's a lot of legacy solutions out there. And this brings a lot of inadequacies, a lot of complacency. There's also too many people and too many companies that are too used to doing things in a particular way. Now, I'm not saying that those ways are wrong. What I'm saying is that you need to do other things as well. There needs to be much better understanding of the entire end-to-end supply chain. Skill sets have been too functionally centric. They've been focused on either manufacturing or procurement, logistics, and so on, but without a solid enough sense of the overall supply chain. And what we need is a better sense of actually seeing the whole picture. We need to communicate exactly why things need to be done in a different way and precisely which benefits will result from these changes. What we need to do is recognize the importance of leadership skills, change management skills, influencing skills. It's the so-called soft skills that need to come to the forefront if we're really going to meet the challenge of managing our end-to-end supply chain in a much more resilient way. You see, the hard skills are mostly already in place, or they're simply not as relevant anymore. But when we start improving agility and resilience in our end-to-end supply chain, it can often be very difficult for people at all levels, and I completely understand this as a training provider. It can be really difficult for organizations to grasp the sheer scale of what has to be achieved. The goalposts keep shifting. There's a new uncertainty. Every time I'm in class teaching students or colleagues, the rapidity, the sheer scale of even how fast uncertainties continue to pop up now is, it's just unheard of. I remember 15 years ago, if I talked about supply chain risk, we would give an example of 9/11 or the volcanic ash cloud. And today there's a new uncertainty almost every day that you need to pick up on, right? So I completely understand when the goalposts shift and the sheer scale of all of these changes, it can be overwhelming. And communicating that scale calls for skills that simply weren't on a supply chain or procurement leaders radar just some years ago. They were certainly not on my radar. They were not on my skill set either as an educator. But I think what I'm saying here is that the future now calls for a reevaluation of supply chain skills. We've got to recognize that yesterday's skills are not the same as tomorrow's skills. There's been a really, strong, big focus on left brain skills, and these are based on things like analysis, analytics, formula, and so on. But we also need to invest in right brain skills, such as understanding the connectivity between parts. We need to think in terms of systems thinking, complex systems, and we need to understand that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's the challenge that really lies ahead of us. Now, finally, what I'd like to leave you with is some food for thought, and actually a checklist that is based on quite an extensive piece of work that we carried out at Skill Dynamics. It's based on our white paper on sourcing for resilience. And any of you that are interested will be able to download this from our website. But what we do here is we provide you with a checklist. So my last few words, my last few minutes or so, I would like to really share with you, I guess, some tangible takeaways that you can already start implementing with your teams. You can start talking with your teams and start mapping out some of these issues. And the first thing that I would suggest is that you map your supply chain as far back as you possibly can, aiming for not just your first tier suppliers, but your second tier and your third tier as well. Ask yourselves, where are our suppliers located? Which trade routes and which shipments do we use, to reach them? And this is especially true for strategic suppliers. Consider some of the kind of early warning systems and capitalize on this information. You need to leverage publicly available data and specialist service providers in order to achieve this. And also, don't just procure for resilience, design for resilience. Aim to eliminate unique items wherever possible. Then one of the biggest challenges that we witnessed through the pandemic years, at least, was when many companies, and Apple included, I did mention right at the beginning, even the most well-oiled supply chains were challenged. What they found was that when they couldn't access key components, that pretty much put a massive bottleneck in their supply chain. So seek to eliminate unique items wherever possible to avoid design having single points of failure. For cost comparison purposes, use total landed cost figures. Build in reasonable assumptions regarding additional inventory requirements and occasional expediting. Think about, how to cater for disappointing your customers if a stock out occurs. What are you going to do about that challenge? Nobody wants to disappoint our customers. Distance your supply chains so that you can distance supply chains, sorry. Like when we think about it from a sustainability point of view, those supply chains that are located very far from view could be quite murky, could be quite opaque. And you might find that they could be non-compliant. So think about your sustainability. The ESG agenda, which we're actually publishing our next white paper around, is not going to go away, especially for supply chains that directly meet consumer demand. So don't overlook these costs of ensuring compliance, governance, carbon and resource footprints. So be aware of 100% compliance might not be possible, particularly when you've got these opaque supply chains. Dual source wherever it's possible, but not from the same country. Think about different locations. Think about, accessing those redundant capacities. Seek redundancy, seek to grow your bandwidth. And whilst reshoring and nearshoring aren't magic bullets, opportunities to still apply them do exist. I think a term that we're using a lot more now is that we're not necessarily shifting just from globalization to localization, although we're seeing a big trend in that because of the rising nationalism and protectionism. But we would rather say that we still have global organizations which seek to meet localized demand. So a term that's been coined as glocal. Now, there's much, much more, of course, but these are just stratagems that will allow most of you to commence your journey to a greater supply chain resilience. And for a lot more information on some of these points that I've just highlighted here and what the checklist is based on, you can, of course, download a copy of our white paper. So on that note, and here is that white paper. On that note, I would like to open up to the floor for any questions that you may have. And I thank you for your attention.